A respectable woman. Understanding the text. Why was Mrs. Baroda unhappy with the information about Governal's visit to their farm? Mrs. Baroda was unhappy with the information about Governal's visit to their farm because he was a man she had heard a lot about but had never met. She was unhappy also because she had planned a period of rest and conversation with her husband, Gaston Baroda, from their busy life throughout all winter. How was Governal different from Mrs. Baroda's expectation? Governal was different from Mrs. Baroda's expectation. As Mrs. Baroda initially thought, Governal was confusing and boring, and that he was not the witty man that her husband had told her about. She imagined him to be tall, thin, and cynical, wearing eyeglasses and holding his hands in his pockets, and she disliked him. But one night on her plantation, she had a chat with him that transformed her dislike for him into a wish for connection with him. How does Mrs. Baroda compare Governal with her husband? Mrs. Baroda finds Governal attractive, but she does not perceive the same traits in him as her husband. She could not find any of the brilliant and promising qualities that Gaston, her husband, had often informed her he possessed in him. Despite his courtesy, Mrs. Baroda considers him unsociable in comparison to her husband because he does not appear to be paying attention to her. Why and how did Mrs. Baroda try to change Governal's solitary habits? Mrs. Baroda tried to change Governal's solitary habits because she did not expect a commotion over his presence, and he was no more interested in facts. She expected him to be more interesting. She attempted to change her solitary habits by assuring him to be more talkative and adaptable to the situation. How does Gaston disagree with his wife on Governal's character? Gaston disagrees with his wife on Governal's character as less interesting and shy figure, indicating rather that he is a remarkable, friendly, interesting, and talkative figure. Why is Gaston surprised with his wife's expression towards the end of the story? Gaston is surprised with his wife's expression towards the end of the story because she proposes by herself to have Governal visit them again before the year ended, which he had not ever expected from her side. Reference to the context. What is the cause of conflict in Mrs. Baroda's mind? What role does Mrs. Baroda, being a respectable woman, play in the story? Mrs. Baroda's attraction to her husband's friend is the main cause of conflict in Mrs. Baroda's mind. Mrs. Baroda appears to be bound by society's perception of what makes a respectable woman. Mrs. Baroda seems to be attracted to Governal, but she controls her urge to touch his face since she believes she's a respectable woman and is probably afraid of what society might think. This gets the character of Governal and contrast to Gaston. From the short story of Respectable Woman, we can find that Governal in the present is a journalist. He is not as social as his friend Gaston since he does not appear to pay enough attention to the people around him. Gaston is the story's only supporting character. He highly appreciates his friend Governal, describing him as intelligent and a man of ideas to his wife. Gaston also appears to love his wife, addressing her as Ma Belle or Chere Ami. Why does Mrs. Baroda not disclose her feeling towards Governal to her husband? Mrs. Baroda does not disclose her feelings toward Governal to her husband because she appears to be restricted to society's opinion. Mrs. Baroda is well aware that society would view her action as inappropriate and unacceptable behavior for a married woman. Her beliefs about what makes a woman respectable in society take priority over her feelings and desires. Her fear of what society might think of her and her perception that she is a respectable woman prevented Mrs. Baroda from telling her husband about her emotions for Governal. The last three sentences of the story bring a kind of twist. After reading these three sentences, how do you analyze Mrs. Baroda's attitude towards Governal? The last three sentences of the story bring a kind of twist in the story. A respectable woman. The story has presented a sudden change in Mrs. Baroda's inner characterization and way of thinking in the last three sentences. Mrs. Baroda has not only changed her mind about Governal, but she may also no longer be bound by society's view of what makes a respectable woman. Mrs. Baroda has achieved freedom outside of the boundaries of society. We can assume that Mrs. Baroda has not only overcome her own and society's perception of what a respectable woman is, but she is also ready to pursue a relationship with Governal by telling Gaston, "I shall be very nice to him." Reference beyond the text. The entry of an outsider into a family has been a recurring subject in both literature and films. Narrate a story, real or imaginative, where an outsider's arrival destroys the intimate relationship between husband and the wife and causes breakup in marital relationship without direct fault of anyone. Anton Chekhov's story about love is a story on this subject. Anton Chekhov's story about love is an interesting story where the arrival of Aloin in Mrs. Luganovich family destroys the intimate relationship between the husband and the wife, and it causes terrible troubles and mental stress to his wife, Anna Luganovich. Mr. Luganovich and Anna are wife-husband living together in the city. Though there is a wide gap of age difference between husband and the wife, they are living happily. In fact, Anna is a young lady of about 22. She is married to a judge, a man of over 40. She is a young woman, beautiful, kind, intelligent, and fascinating. Her gaze, her beautiful and delicate hands, her way of walking, her voice, and her hairstyle are all impressive to anybody. As the story opens, she has a 6 month baby, and later she has another baby. She's been living with her husband in peace and harmony, but the arrival of another man in her life damages her life entirely. Ultimately, she has a neurotic problem, and she has to live alone. The same thing happens in the story A Respectable Woman. With the arrival of Governor in Baroda's family, in the former story, Anna leaves city for Crimea to feel relaxed and refreshed, and here in the story, Mrs. Baroda leaves the plantation for her aunt, Octave, so that she can get relaxed and refreshed from her mental stress. Mrs. Baroda makes an expectation about Governor even before meeting him. Suppose you are a mature girl, boy, and your family members are giving you pressure for getting married. Write in about 200 words describing what qualities you would like to get in your future husband or wife. Marriage is a lifetime decision. That's why one should never rush to the stage until she is fully sure about life partner. Otherwise, it may be the folly of a lifetime. It is a serious matter of life. One should put a lot of thought into intellect before deciding to marry someone. It is not as same as judging a book by its cover, as there are many pages, paragraphs, sentences, and words in it. I hope to see the following qualities in my future wife or husband. He has good manners to show his affection and care. He admits his shortcomings and accepts my follies. Good listener. He enjoys my companies and understands and respects my decision too. He knows my likes and dislikes, my birthday, and remembers to give me little gifts and surprises on different occasions. He is sweet and has a good sense of humor. He never places restrictions on me or the relationships. He respects my family and friends and truly loves me. He can balance his work and family and face challenges. He is independent both financially and emotionally. You can find the note of this chapter at hurry570.com.np. Please refer to the description of this video. Thank you and all the best.